Here's where we are in the governance series. We completed phase 1, seeing the system, letters 1 to 12. We are in phase 2, designing the system, letters 13 to 30. We completed stage 1 through stage 5. We just completed letter 26D, the end of governance by vigilance. We are in stage 6, governance redefined, letters 27 to 30. We are in letter 27A, governance is not the navigator. I would like to briefly revisit the journey that brought us here, to recognize how each part of the series expanded what the executive was capable of seeing and doing. The progression matters because governance develops in much the same way inside an organization. Each new capability depends upon something established before it. Letter 13A described phase 2 specifically as a dependency sequence. Each stage requires the previous stage to be functional before the next one can hold. Phase 1, seeing the system, letters 1 to 12. Phase 1 introduced and defined 34 structural patterns that gave us language for patterns we may have experienced within organizations for years without recognizing what they represented. Once a pattern became visible, we could begin to describe it. Once we could describe it, we could give it a name. And once we could name it, we had a way to recognize when that same structural pattern appeared somewhere else, discuss it consistently with others, and eventually design a response to it. Phase 1 therefore gave us something we did not have before, a common language for seeing organizational experiences not merely as isolated problems or unrelated events, but as recognizable structural patterns within a larger organizational system. Phase 2, design the system, letters 13 to 30. Phase 2 began after the structural patterns had become visible. Letter 13A gave us the project plan for the journey ahead. The structural patterns we would examine, their corresponding design resolutions, the dependencies we believed were important to consider, and the sequence we would use to explore how those designs build upon one another. Phase 1 gave us the before. Phase 2 began building the after. The shift was significant. We were no longer asking only what is happening. We began asking what should be intentionally designed so this structural pattern no longer governs the organization. Stage 1, entering design, letters 13A and 13B. Stage 1 created orientation before action. Letter 13A gave us the map. 13B reminded us that having a map and traveling the terrain are not the same thing. We learned that the 34 structural patterns do not disappear because they have been named, and that organizations naturally want to correct what is visible before recognizing the hidden structural patterns quietly shaping how the organization operates. Stage 1 therefore moved us from recognizing the structural patterns shaping the organization to intentionally designing the capabilities and structures that would operate in their place. Stage 2, stabilizing the core, letters 14 to 17. Once we had the map, we began with decisions, because every organizational system eventually resolves to who decides, what they own, whether they possess the authority to act, and what happens when a decision moves beyond that authority. Stage 2 established ownership and authority as the load-bearing structure for everything that followed. It also introduced appreciative inquiry, shifting our attention from diagnosing what was wrong toward identifying what was already working and intentionally design the possibility the organization wanted to create. Letter 17 then introduced a new lens. Rather than looking at a structural pattern primarily through what had happened or what it had cost the organization, we began asking, what becomes possible? The pattern had not changed. The orientation from which we observed it had. Stage 3, seeing clearly, letters 18 to 20. Once decision ownership and authority existed, another question became possible. What reality is the decision maker actually seeing? A clearly designated executive making decisions from distorted or incomplete signals is not necessarily better positioned than an executive without clear ownership. Stage 3, therefore, examined signal integrity, interpretation visibility, data authority, and architecture. It also revealed that structural patterns rarely operate independently. They layer, interweave, and amplify one another, which means seeing one pattern without seeing its relationships may still leave the organization managing a symptom rather than understanding the system producing it. Stage 4, from activity to coherence, letters 21 to 23. Once the organization could trust what it was seeing, we could ask whether all of its activity was actually producing what leadership intended. Stage 4 examined the relationship between strategy, incentives, behavior, priorities, and execution. The question was no longer whether each department was busy or whether individual projects were successful. We began asking whether the organization's many activities were working together to produce a coherent outcome. The perspective expanded from the performance of individual parts to the relationship among those parts. Stage 5, preventing regression, letters 24 to 26. Stage 5 could only begin after something had been intentionally designed, because you cannot detect drift until there is something to drift from. Here, the structural pattern summary became a compass, the earlier design work became a navigational chart, and the executive navigation chart gave us a disciplined way to move through experience, recognition, name, design, stewardship, and the calibration of each of those phases. The workshops demonstrated how executives could use those instruments to look beneath visible activities, recognize structural patterns, and continually recalibrate as the organization changed. Most importantly, we discovered that the executive should not have to personally hold the organization together. The system holds it because it was built to hold, not because someone is watching. Stage 6, governance redefined, letters 27 to 30. Now we arrive at the stage letter 13A said could not happen earlier. Governance redefined was never intended to be another definition we could introduce at the beginning of the series. Letter 13A described it as something that becomes visible only after the previous structural work is functioning. Governance no longer appears as a layer of oversight imposed upon the organization, but as a design discipline embedded within it. Stage 6 begins with an executive whose perspective has been progressively expanded throughout the series. We are now ready to explore how that expanded perspective changes the executive's relationship with governance. Stage 6 asks something different of you. We are no longer asking you only to recognize a structural pattern or understand its design resolution. We are inviting you to become more intentional about how you observe the organization in the first place. Throughout your career, you have probably been asked to improve performance, reduce risk, implement technology, strengthen operations, develop people, increase innovation, enter new markets, or transform some part of the business. Every one of those responsibilities requires judgment, assessment, decision. Before considering what decision you would make, Stage 6 invites you to consider another question. From what perspective are you making that judgment, assessment, decision? That distinction is important. One question focuses on the answer. The other asks us to examine how we arrived at the answer. Consider the instruments we have been using throughout this series. A lighthouse does not sail the ship. It provides awareness. A compass does not steer the ship. It provides orientation. A telescope does not see the horizon. It expands observation. A navigation chart does not decide which course to follow. It provides a disciplined process for navigating. The navigator exercises judgment. Governance serves the executive in much the same way. Governance is not the navigator. It is the set of instruments that enables the navigator to see farther, orient more accurately, interpret more clearly, and make better informed decisions. The organization does not become more governed because the instruments exist. It becomes more governed because executives intentionally learn to use them. The telescope is particularly useful as we enter Stage 6. The telescope does not have vision. You do. It does not tell you where to look. You decide where to point it. Point it in one direction and something becomes visible. Change direction and something else enters your field of observation. Governance expands the executive's observational capability in much the same way. One of the objectives of stage 6 is to expand the executive's range of thought. That means we need to be careful not to unintentionally narrow that range before we begin. A CEO may enter a discussion thinking about strategy. A CIO may enter through technology. An operations vice president may see a program. A human resources executive may see people development. A board member may see an investment. Each may be looking at the same organization while initially observing something different. The same is true of organizational action. An organization may be developing a new product, implementing a new technology, hiring additional people, acquiring another company, entering a new market, launching an artificial intelligence initiative, restructuring a department, changing a policy, or investing significant time and resources. Before the organization commits itself to any of those courses of action, the executive can intentionally point the telescope in different directions toward purpose. What is the course of action intended to fulfill? Toward stewardship. What is it intended to serve? Toward strategy. What is it intended to advance? Toward design. What is it intended to enable? Toward capability. What is it intended to create? Fulfill, serve, advance, enable, create. These are not 5 required governance questions. They demonstrate 5 different directions from which the same organizational action can be observed. Each direction may reveal something the others do not. That is an important distinction because it would be very easy at this point to conclude that governance is about knowing the right questions to ask. If that were true, we could create another checklist. 5 questions for artificial intelligence, 7 questions for innovation, 10 questions before approving a project. But how would we know that those were the questions that matter? Every organization is different. Every project is different. The people, technologies, customers, assumptions, relationships, and environment are different. Even the same organization confronting what appears to be the same issue at another point in time may be navigating a different reality. Knowing a collection of questions is a skill. Recognizing what deserves to be questioned is a competency. Consider teaching someone to use a compass while standing inside a store. We could explain how the compass works, demonstrate how to read it, and allow the person to practice until they could use it proficiently. Then place that person aboard a ship on the ocean. The compass works exactly the same way as it did in the store, but the environment is different. Weather changes, currents move the ship, visibility changes, new information becomes available, something unexpected appears on the horizon. Knowing how to read the compass is still valuable, but now the navigator must determine what the information means within everything else that is occurring. That is the distinction we will explore throughout stage 6. Most training understandably develops skill. How to use the tool, follow the procedure, apply the methodology, or perform the activity. We are developing business competency. The objective is not to teach you my questions. It is to develop your ability to recognize what the situation is inviting you to question. That changes how we will conduct these workshops. I will not immediately tell you where to point the telescope. We will first enter the experience. Then we will stop and consider what attracted your attention. Perhaps you noticed the data or the people. Perhaps the technology attracted your attention. Perhaps you began wondering about leadership, the customer, the purpose, or something entirely different. Each provides a possible route into the same organizational reality. Think of the alternatives presented by a GPS. Several routes may lead toward the same destination. One may be shorter, another may take longer, but reveal something the shorter route would have missed. New information may cause us to change direction. Occasionally, what we discover along the route may even cause us to reconsider whether we adequately understood the destination when we began. That is how we will use the executive navigation chart in stage 6. Not as a formula that tells us what to think, as a navigation instrument that helps us determine where to look, what we are seeing, what it may be revealing, and where we might look next. There is no requirement that everyone begin in the same place. In fact, the organizational environment itself makes multiple perspectives increasingly important. Organizations consist of interdependent realities that no single perspective can fully reveal. Our first workshop will make that visible. We will enter an artificial intelligence environment that at first may appear to be primarily about technology. We will experience what happened before deciding what it means. Then we will choose several places from which to begin navigating. We are no longer learning how to use the instruments in the store. We are taking them aboard the ship. And once we are there, I will not tell you where to point the telescope. We will begin with what you see. From there, we will explore what becomes visible when we intentionally change our perspective, what each perspective reveals that another may not, and how the executive navigation chart helps us determine where to look next. That is where our first stage 6 workshop begins. Thank you.